Hello, everybody. Hi, Perry. Oh, it's okay. So we are so excited that everyone is here. I still see people trickling in, so we're going to let everyone get to their seats. But before this begins, I wanted to just kind of let you know what this event is. Obviously, this is a candidate forum. I have 7 lovely candidates standing behind me. Oh, you all look so great. And I also want to draw attention to the fact that because this is a forum, all of the candidates will be addressing their own platforms on all of the questions asked tonight, which means they will not be addressing each other's platforms or what each other says, but merely what they their stance and what they are going to propose and move forward should they win this election. I would also like to draw attention to the back of your programs. There's a nice little QR code. Tonight, we will not be addressing the crisis in Ukraine, but should you like to donate, you can go to that QR code where our Bridge Initiative Committee on campus has coordinated to allow Castleton to donate to support Ukraine should you feel you wish to do so. With that, I am going to leave it to our lovely moderators, Adsel Sparrow, Emily Benz, and former Associate Dean of Students, Victoria Ann. Just give them a round of applause. Oh, yes, thank you, thank you, thank you. And they are going to guide us through the rest of tonight. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Perry. It's now time for opening statements, and we are going to give each candidate 3 minutes. We'll start with Lieutenant Governor Gray, and we'll work from left to right. So, Lieutenant Governor.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be here at the Castleton University campus. Go Spartans. I also just want to recognize the wonderful work of everyone putting on this incredible debate. This is the very first in-person debate, I believe, since COVID started. So a huge feat and a huge congrats to everyone involved in this evening's program. I am so honored to serve as your 82nd Lieutenant Governor, but my service to Vermont started long before being elected to this position. It started in 2006 when I helped elect our now Congressman Peter Welch and moved to Washington at 22 years old and was there when we literally opened the door to the Longworth House office building and got to work building systems from scratch to meet the needs of Vermonters. I've lived and worked across our state, but I have a half decade of experience working in and with Congress, working with the House and the Senate. And in 2007, when my younger brother, who graduated from Oxbow High School in Bradford, Vermont, just near Newbury, where I grew up, enlisted in the US Marine Corps, he was deployed to Iraq. And shortly thereafter, when I was working in Congress, the first reports of a lack of weapons of mass destruction, of detainee abuse and torture came to Congress. And I was there on the front lines when that came to light. So I went to work for the International Committee of the Red Cross, working to ensure that our government and Congress was fully compliant with the Geneva Conventions. And I led field missions into Haiti, the Balkans, the Congo, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Georgia. And then I came home to Vermont. And over the last decade, I've lived and worked across the state. I'm a proud product of our education system, from Newbury Elementary School and Oxbow High School through the University of Vermont and Vermont Law School. I've lived in Bethel, in Tunbridge, and South Royalton, where I bartended at the Worthy Burger through law school. And then I spent a year right here in Rutland County, clerking for the late Judge Peter W. Hall on the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. So it's great to be back in Rutland. I've also served statewide as an assistant attorney general, and I served before being elected your lieutenant governor. I've also experienced many of the things that Vermonters experience every day: trying to pay off student loan debt, trying to find an apartment to rent, trying to care for a loved one in a state that doesn't have paid family and medical leave. And as your lieutenant governor, I've worked across the state, showing up, listening, trying to give our communities a voice in Montpelier. And I come to the stage tonight running for Congress because I know that the challenges we face today will not be solved by Vermont alone. So I look forward to talking to you about the policies I'll champion and earning your support. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Dr. Myers?
Hi, I'm pleased and honored to be here at Castleton. This does feel a bit like my backyard. I'm one of the hospital doctors at Rutland Regional. I've been there 9 years, so it's very possible I might have taken care of you or your parents or family members, friends. If so, I hope things went well. I'll tell you a little bit about my background and why I'm running. I'm actually from the Washington, D.C. area. I grew up in D.C. As I'm sure you know, Congress and federal government are basically the cottage industries in Washington. And from an early age, I was interested in Congress, how it works, what the policies are, how they affect people's lives, who are the people making those decisions, how does it reflect the history of this country. Again, at an early age, I was able to intern for 2 years with Senator Edward Kennedy, which was a wonderful experience. I not only got, during those 2 years, got to spend a fair amount of time with Senator Kennedy, but also his staff. And like his brothers, he had an amazing staff, extraordinarily intelligent, hardworking, dedicated, committed, both him and the cause. And I realized that how important having a good staff is on Capitol Hill. And I'm sure Lieutenant Governor Gray would attest to that. Senator Kennedy himself obviously was a tremendous senator, but working together over 45 years, he became one of the most productive senators in the history of the United States. I went away to college, worked a few years after that, and then came back to Washington, D.C. and got a master's degree in social work at Catholic University. Had an interest during that period of time in criminal justice system. So shortly after graduation, was hired to be a probation officer in DC. This was the mid 80s. It was in the midst of the crack cocaine and homicide epidemic. Those two things often go together. And it was an interesting time to be in probation. I also had an interest in how police do their work. So I went through the police academy and became a reserved uniformed police officer in DC. Ultimately became interested in science and medicine, went back and took the pre-med courses and went to medical school and residency at George Washington University, and then spent 16 years in primary care across the river in Alexandria, Virginia. I loved primary care and we could talk about it for a long period of time. It's the heart of medicine. 14 of those years was with my own practice. I had married a woman from Vermont. We had spent a lot of time going back and forth, and in 2012 made the decision to come back to Vermont. And I've been here at Rutland for the last 9 years. Rutland is an amazing hospital. So proud to be working there. It's an example of what a well-run regional hospital, independent regional hospital can do. So I didn't have time to talk about why I'm running, but I think it'll come up. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Ms. Clifford, 3 minutes.
Good evening. I am so honored and thrilled to be with you all tonight. My name is Shanae Chase Clifford, and we're here at Castleton University, and a lot of people tell me and ask me, "How are you old enough to run for Congress?" And the first thing I say is, "Well, the Constitution." But more than that, it's beyond a legal question, right? It's this question about if young people have lived enough or are apt enough to engage in the heart of the crises that we're facing. And absolutely we are. I'm so proud to be born and raised in Vermont. And I grew up on a dirt road and a house full of refugees from the Liberian Civil War. And so from a very young age, I saw what the trauma of war and displacement looked like. We didn't have a ton, and I was a latchkey kid. So I would be the one who answered the door to the gas company, and they'd say, "We have to give you gas, but just to let you know, your parents are really behind." I remember being 16, driving on fumes just to get to school and playing lacrosse with holes in my sneakers because I couldn't ask my parents to shoulder another financial burden. And I know my story is unfortunately not common at all. Our young people in our state and across our nation are supporting their families as soon as they're able. They are shouldering the extreme weight of climate anxiety and pending climate change and wondering if we're going to have a planet to live on. And it takes someone who knows exactly what that experience is like to legislate solutions to address them. We are facing collective challenges, and in order to meet them, we need incredible structural change and politicians who are bold enough to tackle them. We live in a world where politicians, unfortunately, far too many of them will never live with the impact of their decisions. We have politicians that at the drop of a hat will compromise at the expense of working families because that's not who they are and that's not their communities. And in that gap between what we're willing to talk about and what we're actually willing to work for is where our working families fall. And I've seen that in my own family. And that's why I became a social worker. And that's why, I'm glad you brought it up, Dr. Myers, why I became a congressional staffer to do the work. And that's why I'm running for Congress, because I saw firsthand on the Hill, staffers so willing to remove enforcement mechanisms and to compromise at the expense of our most vulnerable communities. And so I'm running for Congress to address our most pressing needs and fight for safe, affordable, dignified housing for all, generation-defining climate action, and making sure that everyone has the right to gainful union-backed employment. Thank you.
And Mr. Madden, 3 minutes.
Thank you so much for coming here, for your curiosity, and for your engagement with this process. It was Abraham Lincoln who famously said, "You don't need a great beard to make great policy. You don't even need to be able to grow one at all." And what I think Abe meant by that is that these things can make us look smarter than we really are. And what I think is underneath that is that we should be judging our representatives not on what is superficial, but on the quality of our ideas and the conviction with which we can convey them, as well as the openness of our hearts and our minds and the depth and richness of the experiences that we can draw from. My name is Liam Madden, and I would like to share with you some of the experiences I will draw from. I am a Marine Corps veteran who became the leader of the nation's largest organization of anti-war Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. I then became an entrepreneur who co-won MIT's Solve Award for organizations innovating climate change solutions. And I am running because I believe there is a more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. And I would like to be part of this public conversation that we call an election, to help introduce some of these ideas that I think are foundational to bringing forth that more beautiful world. In order to build a sustainable and just and wise civilization, we must first liberate ourselves from the stranglehold of the two-party system. I promise you that I am the only candidate in this election who has made the central focus of his campaign rebirthing democracy with structural innovations to the way we solve problems. I am also a son of an immigrant, son of a small business owner, a small restaurateur, and a father who became a social worker. I'm from Vermont, I live in Bellows Falls. And I am also the only person on this stage who Senator Patrick Leahy was referring to when he said, "I wish the officials in the White House and the Pentagon had a fraction of Liam's honesty and courage." And I think the senator was pointing to the defining difference between me and some of my competitors, that honesty combined with courage, combined with a vision for government that galvanizes a unifying story in a more beautiful world. Thank you.
Senator Ballant.
Thank you. So I'm Becca Ballant, and I am the President Pro Tem of the Vermont Senate. But what I really want you to know about me is that I love people, and I'm a mom, and I'm a middle school teacher, and I'm a senator. I mention middle school teacher because if you can survive that hellscape and teach middle school, I believe you can do just about anything. You have to believe in the possibility of change in order to be a middle school teacher. And I often say I have a lot of experience in the Senate, sort of corralling my colleagues who sometimes also act like middle schoolers. part of the reason I became a middle school teacher is because I know what it feels like to be on the outside. So when I was in middle school, that was a time when I was struggling with my own identity. I knew I was gay. I felt completely on the outside with my family, with my school, with my community. And when you go through something like that, you can either become a really angry and bitter person, or you can decide that you're going to approach the world with compassion and an open heart and seek out connection. And that's why I became a middle school teacher myself, to try to create that environment in my own classroom. And I bring those skills with me into my work in the legislature. When you have those stories, your own stories of being on the outside, when you teach students, I taught in 4 rural public schools in Vermont, when you teach students who feel on the outside, that changes you. You go to the State House trying your best to represent those people. And it doesn't have to be whether you're someone who identifies as being part of the LGBTQ community. It's anyone who feels on the outside. And I've been very successful in my role as a legislative leader. I was voted the first woman president pro tem in the history of Vermont unanimously by my peers. That means Republicans, progressives, and Democrats all voted for me, not because we agreed on everything, but because they knew that I had integrity. They knew that I was going to show up for the constituents back home, not just mine, but theirs. I'm very proud of the work that I've been able to get done in the Senate, from the first in the nation reproductive rights amendment, raising the minimum wage, climate action, investments in housing and childcare. So proud of these. And I want to take that same experience and fight and the stories of my students with me to DC. I know what I can do in DC because I've done it here. Thank you.
Mrs. Reddick.
Thank you very much. I am incredibly pleased to be here with you all today. And I just need to say really quickly, I have a rib out and it's a little bit hard to breathe. So if I'm up here looking like I'm heaving, that's why. Taekwondo is a dangerous sport. So I just needed to call that out so I wouldn't be up here awkwardly being worried about my breathing. But I am really excited to be here today. And first I want to share with everyone, my campaign slogan is rigorous honesty. What I promise to you is to always tell you the truth and to answer your questions to the best of my ability with a real answer, not with a politician's answer, because I think that you all deserve the truth. And I think that you are wise enough and discerning enough in your own lives to make the best decisions for you and your family. I believe in you and I have faith in you. And so that is one thing that I will promise to you. I believe I am the only Republican on the stage. And so I do come to you with a more conservative mindset. And that comes from hard work and perseverance. Much like other folks that you're going to hear about, I grew up in rural Vermont. I was bullied mercilessly in school. I've been the victim of crime. And those are all things that I had to learn to overcome. And I had to lean on my community and mentors and people like that to get through it. And that's what I will be encouraging for everyone. I want everyone to have the opportunity to know that life is hard and things are hard and no one escapes suffering in this life. It's what you do with that suffering that matters the most and is a test and a testament of your character. So that's why my husband and I work with organizations like Catalyst Collective, helping at-risk youth overcome the challenges in their life and find their purpose. Catalyst has a 95% effective rate. 95% of the students that go through that course do not re-offend. So we look for practical, real life solutions for people, because we believe that I believe that the government does not have the ability to protect you from everything. It does not have the ability to save you from everything. But what it can do is set up an environment and a circumstance for you to have maximum human flourishing. That's what I believe the role of government is. And in my last few seconds, could someone bring me a pen that works? That'd be awesome. Thank you all very much.
Senator Ram Hinsdale.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. I think this is the first time I've ever been the furthest to the right on something is this debate stage tonight. So it's a pleasure to be with all of you. And I'm surprised to be the first one to acknowledge that it is a beautiful day outside. And we are just so grateful that you have chosen to spend this beautiful evening with us. And I think that's really a testament to the Castleton spirit. I know there are others watching the live stream, probably from by the side of a lake or, in a field somewhere, enjoying the weather. But, it's just so much the case that anytime I come to Castleton, folks are engaged, they're paying attention, and they're thinking about how to change the world. I was here when the Castleton NAACP chapter was founded, and I know that that was partially born out of such a challenging experience with the treatment of Greg Zullo by the police as he was driving home as a student, and how even Greg, through so much pain and deep loss of his humanity, was able to turn that into a representation in a Supreme Court case that changed the way we think about our Constitution and who is not above the law in this state. And you have Rich Clark's polling. You have so many great things going on at Castleton, and it's just a privilege to be with all of you. And in fact, I'm thinking about the experience I had in 2006 when I was a student leader at the University of Vermont. I didn't have a fancy title, but then Senator, in the Vermont Senate, Peter Welch, and then Congressman Bernie Sanders were running for their seats for the first time in the US House and the US Senate. The last time 16 years ago, we had 2 open seats. And they wanted a, big draw because at the time they weren't quite that. And so they asked this rock star senator from Illinois to join them. And, they said, we don't have a student on stage and we're doing the event at UVM, and we should probably have a woman on stage too. And it'd be great if we had a person of color. And all of a sudden they said, that narrows it down to just a few people on campus. And I was asked to join them on stage as a sophomore. And to talk from my own heart about why things like student debt and climate change needed to involve young people. Otherwise, those issues would be resolved on our backs without us at the table. I was pretty proud of myself. And I got off stage, and then this rock star senator from Illinois got up and said, "You know what, Bernie, if you don't behave yourself, we're gonna run Keisha for the Senate instead of you." It was the first time anyone encouraged me to run for office. 2 years later, I became the youngest legislator in the country, and he became the 44th president of the United States. And so I hope the students here tonight know that anything is possible when these seats open up in Washington and when things shift, and you should run for office as well. Thank you.
You will each have 2 minutes to answer the following questions. Given that you are addressing current college students, first, do you believe the president has the authority to cancel student loan debt? And second, how do you intend to address the systemic challenges with the current student loan structure? We'll start with you, Dr. Myers.
Well, thank you. I should add, which I didn't in the introduction, I'm a moderate Democrat. And I know that that's going to reflect in some of my answers. I know that people on the far left, far right, sometimes think of that as a dirty word. I think of moderate as, not that I don't have the aspirations of the progressives, for example, but understand from life experience, professional experience, that sometimes, most often, change has to happen organically, has to happen sometimes step by step. Because if we go for everything, often we get nothing. So when we talk about student debt, this is a hugely complex issue, as I'm sure you know. It has been developing over the last 20 to 30 years. I think back to the time when I was in college, and I believe I'm the oldest person on this stage. People could go to a private school, work part-time on campus and come out with essentially no debt. Obviously, that's absolutely impossible now. Since 1985, inflation in student debt has quadrupled. Since 2000, it's doubled, it's quadrupled since 1985. That's 400%. Obviously, general inflation has not gone up anywhere near that. So we have to ask, how did this happen? It happened because colleges were able to raise their prices with no pushback from the government, from no pushback really from students who often were desperate to take out the loans that would at least give them a chance to get ahead. In terms of the what we're going to do about student debt right now, there are a number of proposals, and I'm almost out of time. We will talk about this. I'll let the others continue. Sorry.
Ms. Clifford?
Yes, the president does have authority to cancel student debt, and we've seen him do it. He's canceled, I think, about $17 billion in student debt, which is important and is a lifeline to so many students, but it is not enough. And also, Congress has the authority to, if there are leaders who are willing to push and are willing to have that conversation on the congressional floor. You know, for generations, we have told young people that your ticket out of intergenerational poverty, your ticket up and out is higher education, and it should be. But for far too many students, the weight of crushing student loan debt makes that dream impossible. It's estimated that 53% of millennials, like myself, are not able to buy a home because their student loan debt either disqualifies them for a mortgage or they can't afford both their student loan payments and a mortgage payment. We are hampering our communities with incredible sums of student loan debt. And as the question was asked, we do need to address the incredible pace at which tuition has increased. And this is at an undergraduate level and a graduate level. I'll share quickly my experience. I went to a graduate school of social work, and in order to attain that degree, you need to be able to work up to 30 hours a week for free. Who was able to do that? And so some of my best friends who wanted to become those social workers that they needed in school so desperately, they wanted to be those Black and brown social workers that they so desperately needed when they were young people, are taking out tens of thousands and upwards of hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt to be able to provide essential public services to their communities. So we need to address at a root level our credentialing systems, and we also need to hold and universities accountable that have billions of dollars in their endowments for paying their fair share for students as well.
Mr. Madden?
Does the president have the authority to cancel student debt? I think that depends on which portion of student debt we're talking about. Is it something that is totally within the jurisdiction of the executive branch? Then maybe, but by and large, probably not. In terms of the broader scope of where I stand on education and the financing of education, I received most of the funding that helped enable me to attend university thanks to the GI Bill. And that completely changed my life, changed the trajectory of what was possible for me. And I'd like to see the same benefits that were available to me be available to other young people for non-military kinds of service. Because I don't see why it has to be that a young person should risk their life in an often for-profit and senseless war in order to attain a higher education. And this is why I support the creation of a service corps, a civilian service corps on the scale of the military that is designed to offer meaningful avenues of contribution and teach hard skills to young people to help build the regenerative, sustainable, and just society that we need to build. We should have a Marine Corps, but why not also a building corps or a teaching corps or a healthcare corps or a regenerative Agriculture and Ecosystem Restoration Corps. But that still doesn't fully explain why the cost of education has gotten so high. And I think we must address the fact that for some people, college isn't going to provide them a meaningful and secure livelihood. And vocational training could do much better. And part of the reasons I have the job I have in the renewable energy industry is largely thanks to vocational training I received and not my college education. So I think we need to be thinking about what big government projects we can do and what personal level decisions we can make, as well as how the market could play a role. And all three of these types of levels of strategy need to be involved in creating holistic and effective policy. Thank you.
Senator Ballard.
Thank you. Should student debt be canceled? Yes. Should the president and Congress take this on? Yes. I had significant student loans, but my spouse and I were able to make it work because I had a good union job at the time. And we scrimped and we saved and we were able to buy a house just before I turned 40. But things are much tougher for those of you out there. And a good friend told me recently, she said, I keep having the same argument with my dad. My husband and I, we work as hard as we can. We have to, pay down our student debt. We're trying to pay for childcare. We can barely make our mortgage. And every time it comes up, he says to us, when I was your age, and then he lists all the ways in which he feels like his generation worked harder. And that's why they got ahead. It's because they worked harder. And she told me, we can't work any harder. And I don't understand why he keeps saying this. And here's what I told her. You're not wrong. This isn't all in your mind. Millennials and Gen Z are doing something that the older generation did not have to do. What you are facing is different, from higher education costs to higher housing costs to higher healthcare expenses. You are carrying more debt than the baby boomers did. Far more debt. And I want to say that out there and make it clear, because I have this conversation a lot with my constituents and some of my older colleagues. It is different. What you're doing is different, and you need help from all of us. You need a fair shot, and that means canceling student loan debt. And I know the president has, he has supported canceling a small amount of debt. I support much more sweeping cancellation of debt. And I also want to say it's just the first step. We have to make higher education more affordable. Thank you.
Mrs. Reddick.
I love this question. Can we get a show of hands of who will be benefiting if we forgive student loans? Everybody? I definitely will. I'm not going to lie. I'll benefit from that. What is interesting is many people don't know is that during the Obama administration, the federal government nationalized the student loan industry. And they did that so that they could use the interest on student loans to pay for the subsidies of the Affordable Care Act. I bet very few people in this room knew that that was the case. So while I personally will benefit from student loan debt being canceled, the people who count on the Affordable Care Act subsidies probably won't appreciate it unless we find some other funding mechanism. So I think that's something that we should take under serious consideration. And for folks who have degrees like social work, there are forgiveness options. If you go to work and you work for organizations that need your services, you can get your student loans forgiven. And so one of the things I think is really important for everyone to understand, we have to make systemic changes now so that future generations don't go through what myself and folks like you are going through. Because the reality is our education system, along with the federal government, is a predatory lender. They told you that you could get out of generational poverty by becoming part of the managerial class with your college degree. And that was a lie that they told you, because a lot of times you can't make enough money with your various degree to ever hope to pay off that student loan. And so they've saddled generations of Americans with this debt we can't possibly overcome. So, and no, Joe Biden does not have the authority. We have separation of powers. executive, legislative, and judicial branches. We do not have a king. Thank you.
Senator Ram Hinsdale.
Thank you. So absolutely, yes, the president does have the authority to cancel student loan debt. And what I hope that draws attention to is that we have federal institutions that are now acting like a lobbying industry in Washington. College Board, Fannie Mae, all of these entities are charging higher and higher interest rates. Some folks may remember I was in the legislature when we had a fight to allow VSAC to continue to process a majority of student loans in the state because they were doing it at a lower interest rate. And so now we have a system that is lobbying for itself. We need free college education as well, particularly from our public system. And we have disinvested for so long in our public education system, from pensions and supporting our faculty to investing in our staff. I'm proud to support an effort just in our Vermont legislature to make sure you as faculty and staff have a voice on your governing bodies, because for so long we have begun treating college like an industry and a business and not like the pathway to unlock the potential and the future for our young people. So I appreciate so much the faculty and staff here and everything you do to fight for quality, affordable education for young people while still being able to take care of yourselves and your families. And finally, I just want to say I was a free lunch kid, and, knowing that being on the free lunch program could get access to taking the SATs, to applying for college for free, was a lifesaver. So for so many folks, when we talk about canceling student debt, we're still not talking about how to make sure people have those pathways to college, to apprenticeships, to service in whatever way will help them gain a foothold in the middle class and be able to afford a stable and thriving life in this country. Not only do millennials not have access to the same affordable opportunities, but they also have the least generational wealth that's been transferred to them. And it's suffocating us. So just appreciating what all of you are doing to try and change that conversation here and in Washington.
Lieutenant Governor Gray.
As I was driving here this evening, I stopped in Rutland and popped by the Paramount Theater where folks were getting together for a forum this evening. And I ran into a gentleman who also went to Vermont Law School, and we were talking, and he said, Molly, he said, having student loan debt is like having a mortgage on my life. And I couldn't agree more. I grew up in Newberry on a farm. I was able to go to college because of an athletic scholarship. I skied for the University of Vermont, and then took about 5 years off before I was working in Washington, but decided to come home to Vermont and to go to Vermont Law School. And I didn't have a scholarship, and I bartended through law school to try to keep my loans down while I was in school, but graduated with over $100,000 in student loan debt. So I've never known what it's been like not to work a second job. When I was serving as an assistant attorney general, I taught law classes at night at the law school where I had the student loan debt from. And what I know is what so many Vermonters know when you're dealing with student loan debt. I've never owned a home. I've always rented. I've had to make pretty significant decisions about caring for loved ones and trying to pay the bills. Decisions around having a family are all stalled because of that debt. And I work really hard and care deeply about serving our state. Vermonters have $2.5 billion in student loan debt. So do I support canceling student loan debt? Yes. Do I believe that the president has some authority? Yes, as it relates to federal loans. Do I believe Congress has authority? Absolutely. But what I think is most important is not only do we figure out what does canceling look like and what does it mean, but really what does it mean to invest in access to higher education and to invest in growing a workforce, everything from our technical schools and our vocational centers to apprenticeships, if that's the right path, to free 2-year associate's degrees for the high demand jobs that we have right now, from nursing to carpenters to electricians to plumbers. We have to reform our system. So it's not just about canceling the debt, it's building a system that works and sets us up for a better future.
Thank you.
The next question is, there is near consensus in the scientific community that the climate crisis is currently our most pressing issue. How do you intend to use your position in Congress to address this issue? Ms. Clifford, you're first.
We cannot individualize our way out of collective crisis. And for too long, our working families and individuals have been asked to make different consumer decisions to combat climate catastrophe. We have to work at a systemic level, and we also need to make sure that our communities are insulated from the effects as we make just transitions. So certainly, we need to pass a Green New Deal, and that's not just the resolution, that's all Green New Deal legislation. And we also need to work beyond what has green in front of it and also make sure that our working families earn a livable wage so that they are insulated from changes as we accurately price fossil fuels and as we end fossil fuel subsidies. We also need to make sure that our families have places to live. Everyone in our state needs to have, and in our nation, have safe, affordable, dignified housing. And especially as we see increased climate migration, that is more true than ever. We need to make investments in our affordable housing and make sure that those investments include climate resiliency. And to that point, we need to make sure in every single one of our legislative endeavors, we are addressing climate resiliency. This is not going to be something that we can just electric car our way out of. We also need to make sure that we are addressing systemic level change and ensuring that our communities are insulated. And I think an important way we can do that as well is protecting our farmers and making sure that there is incentives for increased regenerative agriculture and making sure that our food systems are protected, because it's our small farms who are going to be at the front line of our food systems as across the country, our mass industrial farms can no longer sustain their land. So we need to make sure that as we face a 2023 reauthorization of the Farm Bill, that the Farm Bill has an explicit climate title and that we're protecting each of our communities, not just with green legislation, but making sure that working families are protected as we make these changes.
Mr. Madden.
I believe I am the only one so far who has made a public, logical connection between our sustainability crisis and the fact that we have an economy that is premised on never-ending growth, which is itself driven by a treadmill of never-ending debt. And if you can follow me here, you can't have never-ending things if you want a sustainable model of civilization. So while I believe all of my opponents understand the severity and the urgency of climate change, I have yet to hear any of them mention this most inconvenient truth, which is that we can't keep the structure of our economy fundamentally the same and just run it with new technologies. And I say that with some degree of credibility as the only person on this stage who is a professional in the renewable energy industry. What we need is an economy that uses less energy, period, not just less fossil fuel energy. And if we do that democratically, we will be better off for it. We need an economy that reuses and recycles all materials. And what we need most are the tools to solve a huge, complex, and scary problem like restructuring an economy democratically. And that is why the heart of my campaign is called Rebirthing Democracy. It's about creating the systemic tools, the mindsets, and the structural innovations technologically as well as legally that we need to actually democratically contend with this scale of challenge. And what almost every Democrat will say is that we need a Green New Deal. But if you didn't fall asleep in history class, you'll know that the original New Deal did not solve the underlying crisis of the Depression. It took a unifying story. It took nationalizing industries. It took a Manhattan Project. It took something more on the scale of rebirthing democracy, not just a New Deal. Thank you.
Senator Balint.
Thank you. And just quickly, I take issue with your characterization of history being boring as a history teacher myself. Just going to set that stake in the ground. I care about this issue a whole lot. I have an 11-year-old and a 14-year-old, and we talk about climate change around the dinner table just about every week. And my kids say things like, are we going to still have winter here in Vermont? Are we still going to have snow? And it is an existential crisis for all of us. And I feel it as a legislator, and I feel it as a parent. And it has real consequences in our agriculture community here in Vermont. We know this, but by extension, it impacts all of us on the stage and all of you out in the audience. Our summers are hotter, our springs are wetter, we have more Lyme disease, our maple season is happening earlier. And we know we have to act now. It's already happening. And I live in Windham County, and we were hammered by Tropical Storm Irene, absolutely hammered. And you know, you're in Bells Falls. With every storm that comes by, it happens all over again. We're losing farm fields. People who live in low-lying areas who tend to be low-income Vermonters are getting impacted the most. And that's why this year in the budget, I led the Senate in passing a budget that has over $200 million in climate mitigation efforts to meet the requirements of our Global Warming Solutions Act. The majority of that funding is going to go to those most impacted by climate change. But as we said here already, we need a national response, right? We can't do it alone individually or just here in Vermont. So we need to mobilize a generation of all of you that will continue to demand change. And it is Green New Deal policy, but it's also making the fossil fuel companies pay their fair share of taxes commensurate with the damage that they've done. Thank you.
Mrs. Reddick.
Thank you for the question. I want to first start out by saying that I have been a steward of my environment since I was a child. We convinced our parents to start recycling when I was a kid, long before it was mandatory. When I was in 4th grade, I did an interview with the president of Rowley Fuels after an oil spill in the Lamoille River in the town where I grew up of Milton. And so I just want to first start by saying, I don't know anyone personally who does not care about the environment, who does not want clean air, clean water, and all of these things. What we do often disagree about is what to do about it, and if it's appropriate to offshore our pollution to other countries in the form of renewables. So many of you may know, as an example, solar panels and wind turbines are made with rare earth minerals that are mined with child slave labor in countries where they don't have an EPA and they don't care about the environment and they're willing to pollute all they want. So really, the renewable energy sector has just offshored our pollution to another country. And I don't believe that is a real solution. When I talk to folks who are environmentalists, who study the environment, what they say is the most important thing that we need to do is reduce consumption. So that's why I tell people, I have a Galaxy S8, okay? I have a 6-year-old phone because it still works. If you care about the environment, don't get a new laptop every year. Don't get a new cell phone every year. Reduce your consumption. And in a state where it's winter 9 months out of the year, to demonize the people who bring us our heat, I think is a mistake. We can do better. We can find better energy solutions through innovation, just like the American people have for decades. Thank you.
Senator Rom Hinsdale.
Thank you. Addressing the imminent and very real threat of climate change is my #1 priority and why I'm asking you to send me to Washington. In fact, when I was a young person around the age of some of you all, I traveled a lot to Rutland County and around the state to look at the impacts of climate change that were already present in Vermont, and particularly how they were impacting those most left behind. As many of you know, you have a lot of mobile home communities here in Rutland County. They're an affordable and meaningful option for people to have access to some semblance of ownership. And when we look at Tropical Storm Irene, 8% of the state lived in mobile home communities during that flooding event, and they were 40% of the flooding victims. So the disparities have not just been real across the globe or in our country where we see sea levels rising in New Orleans or along the coasts, but right here in Vermont, where people face disparate heat vulnerability, flooding vulnerability, energy poverty. Rutland has the highest asthma rates in the state. And that's what got me into the legislature, is looking at those disparities and trying to not just say climate change is real and it's here and we need to address it. But if we don't center those otherwise most left behind, then we will fail at the task. We will be too late because we already know we've lost species who couldn't speak for themselves. And now we're losing communities that lack political power. The bill I introduced when I was a student at UVM was an environmental justice framework for the state. And I'm proud to say that that bill passed the Senate 2 weeks ago and is poised to pass the House this week. And so, you know, a lot of students, especially from Castleton, have talked about S148, but the reality is it's not just about addressing climate change, but when we think about what the IPCC called the human atlas of suffering, that atlas begins with the communities that are most vulnerable and those most left behind. And that's where we need to begin our work. Thank you.
Lieutenant Governor Gray.
Everything that we're addressing here tonight, student loan debt, and there'll be some other topics, won't matter if we don't address climate change. And Senator Ballant was talking about her kitchen table. I'm the proud mom now of 2 stepkids, a 10 and 12-year-olds, and they have the same questions. They have a lot of questions, and they are good questions about why aren't we doing enough and when are we going to act? I was at my folks' farm this weekend and helped put wood into the greenhouse fires, because if we want to have a reliable growing season now, a lot of farmers know that we have to have more greenhouses. If we want to have snow, I don't think we have 9 months of winter. I think we've got like 3 now, but we're already losing a month of winter. And Killington knows that if they want to have reliable snow, they have to make snow. We have more tick-borne illness, as was mentioned. We are feeling the impacts of climate change on everything we hold dear in this state. And we already know that we have climate migrants arriving in Vermont. So I do support a Green New Deal, but I also support action right now by Congress. And I see the action in 3 levels. 1, what are we going to do to support what's happening here in the state to make sure more Vermonters, like my brothers, can get into electric vehicles, although they tell me you can't tow anything with a Prius, so we have to make that possible. That we invest in weatherization, we invest in making heat pumps accessible for everyone. 2, at the national level, we need to do everything we can to end fossil fuel subsidies, increase investments in solar and renewable energy. And then 3, at the international level. And I can tell you as an international lawyer, we cannot go at it alone. We have to be consistent in our support for the Paris Agreement. And I'm proud to have the support of the chief negotiator of the Paris Agreement, Todd Stern, who said that we have to be consistent. We have to stand together, working with our allies, working with countries around the world to address climate change right now.
And Dr. Myers.
Thank you. I think this is the most massive, difficult problem that we're facing here and increasingly around the world. It's difficult for a number of reasons. Number 1, whatever we do, practically whatever we do, the results may not be seen for years. And we know that people like to see results sooner. Whatever we do is going to affect different regions, or we're going to have to get buy-in from different regions, which are being affected differently by climate change. We're going to have a cohesive approach. And we know that climate change has become a political football like so many other things. The problem in the United States is that we can have wonderful policies for 4 years and a new administration comes in and tears them up. And that's not the way we're going to make progress in a long-term problem like this. I think it has to be realistic. We can't simply do away with fossil fuels tomorrow. We've seen Russia cutting off 10% of the fuel, what that has done to the world's economy and countries around the world, which are now facing famine. So we're going to need to recognize that this is going to take a long time and we can't take such abrupt measures that's going to hurt people more than help them in the short run. It's going to be multifaceted, including a lot of government investment, because often private equity companies are in it for the short-term profit. They're not going to be there for the long term. It's going to involve tax incentives. And one point I want to make, which we haven't made, is it's going to involve nuclear power. There is a lot of fear around nuclear power, and Germany, unfortunately, decommissioned all of their nuclear reactors in a very short period of time due to political pressure. They now depend on Russia for their fuel. The new nuclear reactors are smaller, safer, less expensive, very clean power, and we have to make that part of our effort. So what it really comes down to is consistency, and let's have a realistic approach.
Thank you. Your next question is, coming from a state like Vermont, where diversity is relatively limited, how can you use your platform to protect, promote, and provide representation for all Vermonters, especially members of the BIPOC community? We'll start with you, Mr. Madden.
To give you a sense of where I'm coming from here, I think it's important to just zoom out to the context that slavery was a grotesque injustice that our nation inflicted on the enslaved. And so was Jim Crow, and so was the new Jim Crow that followed. And this has sent shockwaves of trauma, both psychological and economic, throughout generations. And if we are serious about healing that trauma, I think a part of that conversation needs to be on a federal level reparations, because there is a debt owed. The 40 acres of the mule the government promised were never delivered. But at the same time, we need to make sure that we are rigorously strengthening the empathy and accountability of our police departments, as well as making sure that we have much more equitable distribution of educational resources for all of America's children. And that knowing that these are my values and that I have taken personal and legal and physical risks to stand up against racism, I will also say that there is such a thing as fundamentalism on this issue, on both the racist and anti-racist side. And I believe it is worth distinguishing and distancing myself from an anti-racist fundamentalist, because I do not believe that all white people are white supremacists. And I do not believe in demonizing or abolishing the police. And I do not believe in simplistic binaries like you are either racist or anti-racist. I would not support a federal department of anti-racism that has the power to abolish federal law. I believe the best foundation for a racially harmonious movement of working people to build a just and sustainable society is the shared economic interests of working people and the human interests that transcend economics. Thank you.
Senator Ballant.
First and foremost, we in Vermont, and especially white people in Vermont, we need to acknowledge that systemic racism is real. And I start from there because I feel like I have to have that conversation over and over with some of my constituents and some of my colleagues. So we have to start from that place. And that's not a given that people accept that. And I need us to know that we're not immune from this in Vermont. We have one of the most disparate rates of incarceration of Black and BIPOC people in the nation here in Vermont. And I look at this issue through the lens of a school teacher. I have taught in 4 different rural public schools here in Vermont, and the majority of my students were white. And the issues for my students, who were students of color, were magnified. And we know that if you are a Black or BIPOC kid living in Vermont right now, and you're attending public school, you're much more likely to be suspended or expelled. So we need, as white people, to be brave and have courageous conversations with our neighbors and our colleagues. And that will be the way in which I do my work in Congress, is continuing to use that lens for the work that I do. I have supported fair and impartial policing efforts here in Vermont. Worked on that since my very first year in the Senate. I brought an anti-bias training along with Kaya Morris and Deanna Gonzalez, who are two of my colleagues, first ones to bring that into the frame of the work that we're doing in the legislature. I have supported initiatives on criminal justice reform, and those are all of the work that I would continue to do in Congress. But it has to be the lens through which we do all of our work, and that's what I intend to do. Thank you.
Mrs. Reddick.
This is one of the questions that I was the most looking forward to getting to answer. It's something that I'm incredibly passionate about. Not only do I come from a family that is half white and half Mexican, but I also married a Black man. So now my family is white, Mexican, and Black, and all other shades of the spectrum. So I want to first reject the acronym BIPOC, because it implies that everyone who is not white is a monolith, and as if they're having the same kinds of problems and struggles and issues as each other. And that's not real. That's not reality. So I first want to just say, everyone is an individual. Every person is an individual. Every group is an individual. And there are so many things that we struggle with that do not have to do with our race. Many more Americans are struggling with class issues when they come from lower classes, if they grow up in inner cities, if they have a lack of opportunity and access to education, funding opportunities, and things like that. That's why I was a huge, huge proponent of the economic opportunity zones that were created by the last administration. It's why my husband and I work with at-risk youth. I'm an entrepreneur myself. I made some poor decisions in my youth, and it led me to a situation where I'm discriminated against in housing and in work. And so, and my husband is a filmmaker. He is a dark-skinned Black man. There are not a lot of lead actors that he can double as a stuntman for. So our family has experienced this. We see what it's like for people to struggle. And the way that we were able to overcome that was through entrepreneurship. My husband started his own film business, and I started my own accounting business. And so when we give people the opportunity to take care of themselves without having to ask permission for a paycheck, you empower them for the rest of their life. Thank you.
Senator Ram Hinsdale.
Thank you. So I am the first woman of color in the Vermont State Senate. And in this race and in so many of my past races as the first person of color representing Burlington in the House, people would say, well, what do I tell folks when they say you don't look like a Vermonter? And I say, well, tell them this is what a Vermonter looks like. And that's why I'm in this race. That's why I do what I do. That's why I get up every day and fight for so many Vermonters who don't have a voice, people who want to live in rural communities and yet feel like they're questioned all the time. How long have you lived here? Where are you from? You know, people whose families crossed oceans and deserts and took great risks just to live in a place where we could solve conflicts peacefully and live close to the land. The Vermont dream is a dream that many of us share, and yet so many of us are made to feel like we don't belong in rural places and spaces. And I can tell you that electing me, the daughter of immigrants, to Washington in this race would change the conversation about what's happening in rural America. And what have I already been doing? You heard a little bit about the disparate rate of suspension and expulsion in our schools. We can't just have courageous conversations. We have to have the courage to change the laws. From 2014 onward, I was fighting to end the use of suspension and expulsion on small children in our state. We know it's disparate for kids of color and kids with disabilities. And finally, this past year, we were able to not only end the use of expulsion for small kids, but the House Education Committee said, why are we suspending small children? And we're working to limit the use of suspension and expulsion altogether as a behavioral tool. I proudly created, with so many others, the Bright Leadership Institute with people like Tabitha Moore and Lisa Ryan and Mia Schultz and people who are fighting alongside you every day in these communities to make sure that I may be the first, but I am not the last, and that other people of color in the state feel safe and supported when they run for office as well. Thank you.
Lieutenant Governor Gray.
I first want to address the question of making our offices accessible. When I worked for Congressman Welch, starting to build an office from scratch, we had to think about what does it mean to have Vermonters come into an office with different abilities or languages, and what does it mean to really be responsive to constituent services? So I think that's a really, really important piece. How do we set up our offices in a way that they are accessible to every Vermonter? And especially the new Vermonters that we are welcoming to the state every day, be it Afghan refugees or potentially refugees coming from Ukraine. But I also want to address not only our duty, but also our obligation to remove the barriers to housing, to education, to healthcare, to really address systemic racism that does exist here in Vermont. And I pulled a few facts and figures together. We know right now that about 70% of white households in Vermont have home ownership, but only 21% of Black households in Vermont. Black Vermonters are 3.5 times more likely to be pulled over in a traffic stop. And nationally, Black Americans are 5 to 1 pulled over more often, but here in Vermont, 10 to 1 pulled over more often. So the data speaks for itself. I wanted to bring my response, though, back to what I know is happening right here on this campus. Castleton has always been a leader on criminal justice reform, training the next generation of criminal justice leaders. I do support Biden's plan to not only invest in accountability, which we need for law enforcement across this country without question, but also to invest in providing support to communities to make sure that the next generation of restorative justice leaders, which I hope are coming out of the school, criminal justice leaders, civil rights and human rights lawyers like myself, are ready to bring the very, very best of what we can offer as a state to our communities.
Dr. Myers.
Thank you. This is such a difficult problem because it gets to people's hearts and things that they will say, things that they can't say, things that they grew up with, things that they learned when they were very young. It gets to human compassion and empathy and understanding, of which we have rather short supply in this country at this time. It's not isolated to the United States, obviously. Nearly every country in the world has some racial difficulties. In some cases, such as India right now, where it's more religious, they're literally killing each other by the dozens. I don't think we can necessarily legislate our way out of this problem. There are certain laws, such as the civil rights laws in the 1960s, which were extremely important, but other ways we're trying to legislate may actually be counterproductive. We tried forced busing in the 1970s in order to integrate schools. It backfired and actually led to more segregation and more animosity. One of the things I will say, and I hope this doesn't offend too many people here, but Vermont is one of the whitest states in the country. And for those who have grown up in this state and have not been living in Black communities, may not understand some of the realities. I know as a probation officer, I would walk into people's homes, hardworking middle-class people who were barricaded in their homes because they couldn't go out. They couldn't let their children out. They don't want to defund the police. They actually want more police. What they want is fair and equitable police who are actually going to protect them, but they don't want less police. And I think coming to some of that understanding, deep understanding, will help us move forward as a community. Thank you.
Ms. Clifford.
I love being from Vermont. But as a Black woman who has lived here almost all of my life, I know what it feels like to not be loved back by your community. It is something that I have experienced firsthand and seen my mom and my brothers and so much of my family go through in this state, in our communities. And so there's a lot I can say here because this is a perspective that I carry with me. And in how I think about every issue. But I'll focus on a couple key policy areas here. And I want to push back against the idea. I mean, this is 400 years of codified state sanctioned violence and policy violence. These are all choices that we've made. And so we can make different policy choices to live in a better world and to legislate a better world for Black and brown communities. And we can do that by baby bonds. This idea, and it's a piece of legislation I worked on in the Hill, this idea that every child gets a savings account when they're born, and it grows as they grow up. And when they're 18, they can access that account to use it for wealth building activities. So that includes starting a business, going to school, or buying a house. I also worked on legislation, as has been mentioned on the stage here, to focus on root causes as well and unpacking our school to confinement nexus. So I worked on legislation to end push out, which is this phenomenon that's been mentioned where particularly young Black girls are disproportionately punished, whether that's by corporeal punishment, whether that's restraint, expulsion, or suspension, and also worked on a bill called Counseling Not Criminalization in Schools, which would divert federal funding for police and use that money to hire more social workers, more nurses, more school psychologists, and more behavioral health professionals in our school. I'm out of time. This is an issue I could talk about for a very long time, but there are multiple ways that our federal government owes our communities, and there are real policy solutions and not just conversations, but real action that can be had. Sorry. It's okay. I was over.
Before we ask you our last question, I will want to remind you that we are over time, so please try to keep your answers to 2 minutes. And now our final question. We have seen an increased need to address mental health on college campuses. What national policies would you support that could address the mental health challenges on college campuses? Senator Ballant, you're first.
Thank you. I've been very open on the campaign trail in the last year of my work in the Senate about my own struggles with anxiety and depression. And when I first started talking about it publicly, some of my colleagues said that I shouldn't talk about it because it was going to hurt my political career. But as I traveled around the state, people would come up to me at town meeting, they'd come up to me at the post office and at the supermarket and say, thank you. Thank you for naming the thing that so many of us are dealing with personally, or in our families and our communities. And we have to tell the truth about mental health. That's the only way we're going to eliminate the stigma. And 30 years ago, the biggest threat to young adults came from binge drinking, drunk driving, teen pregnancy, and smoking. These have all fallen sharply in that time. What has not fallen sharply is the mental health. We have an increase in depression and anxiety. We have an increase in suicide. In the last 13 years, we've seen a 60% increase. Now we're still trying to figure out what that can be attributed to. There's a few things that we know about young adults right now. They're getting less sleep, they're getting less exercise, and they're getting less direct connection with their peers and their friends. And coming out of this pandemic, a lot of people are saying, we are struggling with a mental health crisis because of the pandemic. And that's just not true. It has made it worse, but it was there before the pandemic hit. So it will be a cornerstone of my work in Congress to continue the work of former Representative Patrick Kennedy, who's been a champion on these issues. I want a future where everyone gets the health care they deserve and that it doesn't end at the neck. Thank you.
Mrs. Reddick.
I'm also incredibly passionate about this conversation, so I'll probably second everything everyone says on this stage. The reality that we're dealing with is that people are less and less connected with one another, and human beings need each other. I know that there's introverts in this room and you're thinking to yourself, no, I don't. But you do. Even the introverts do. We need each other. We need family. We need community. And as our society has gotten more fractured, we don't hang out with our parents as much, our siblings, our grandparents. We don't have the same kind of family unit that we used to. And so a lot of times we end up turning to things like social media to find comfort. And we know that the clicks and the likes and all of these things, the swiping left and swiping right affects your dopamine and your serotonin. And so we're looking constantly to these fleeting, fake ways to make ourselves feel better. Vermont has the highest rate of drug abuse in the country and saw the highest increase in suicides and overdose deaths. And so when we're talking about a crisis, it really is a crisis. And so what we need is for you all to know that you have a future and you have hope. And listen to everything we've been talking about tonight. Student loan debt, you're never going to make it. You're never going to have a house. You're never going to have a family. The world's going to end in 10 years because of the climate. Like everything that you're surrounded by all the time is that the world is ending and there is no hope. And the only way that I have learned to overcome that kind of thing is to seek outside help, outside counsel, and to listen to people who can teach me to live in the present moment and be okay with things being unperfect, and to seek out the truth to see if the world really is ending like I'm told. Thank you.
Senator Ram Hinsdale.
Well, thank you. Just following that, Mrs. Reddick, I just want to make sure, you all as young people know you have folks around you. You may not have enough mental health counselors, and we should fix that. But you all give us, I always say young people don't give me hope, because that means I'm putting all of the expectation on you to solve all of the crushing issues you just heard about, but you give me courage, because you are facing a changing world and you are facing, new anxieties and new challenges. And you are doing it in a way where you are reaching for each other. You are breaking isolation. And you're doing it with great resilience and beauty. And it's something that we can learn from and have gratitude for. And it doesn't mean that you have to do that without also being able to advocate for what should change. I think like many of us, I grew up with a family member. My sister has a dual diagnosis and acute mental illness. And she reminds me all the time that just because she is experiencing acute mental health issues, that doesn't mean that all of us don't need to pay attention to mental health as basic health care, and to make sure that just like we might go get our physical health checked up, we should have our mental health checked up and break the stigma around getting access to counseling and access to care. And when we do that, it needs to be there. And that means compensating licensed clinicians better and mental health professionals. It means just funding colleges and institutions better so you can have counselors available. And we know it can't just be college, again, because that depends on who makes it there. And when I was in the legislature in 2011, when we were fighting for universal health care, those who opposed universal health care would say that you're pulling young people in a system that they don't benefit from. And nothing could be further from the truth. Young people are the least likely to have access to healthcare, be it for their physical or mental health needs. And so this is something that we need to turn around in a larger system of not just taking care of our mental health as something separate, but recognizing that we need parity in how we treat people altogether. Thank you.
Lieutenant Governor Gray.
We have to talk about it. We have to end the stigma. Growing up on the farm, my folks said, go outside and play. We did not talk about mental health challenges. And we all, in some way, in some form, someone we love has dealt with mental health crisis or mental health challenge. I wanted to share personally, over the last year, serving as your lieutenant governor, as soon as the legislature ended, I got in my car and drove out and tried to get to every county in the state and tried to spend a week connecting with Vermonters and listening and just understanding how did the pandemic impact you. mental health, especially amongst our young people, was the fourth issue that came up, fourth in my report, but it was the issue that came up again and again and again. And I remember visiting the emergency room at UVM, and the head of pediatrics said, "Molly, you have to come in." So I came in, and the day I was there, there were a handful of kids, Vermont kids, who had been in the emergency room for days. And what I learned was that over the last year, children, young people, teens had been spending on average 4 days in our emergency rooms in mental health crisis. So as your congresswoman, I absolutely want to be on education and labor. I want to be able to work on energy and commerce. Those are two committees that deal with two things: workforce. How do we invest in a mental health workforce? How do we make sure that our mental health care providers are fully compensated and trained and valued in our communities? To making sure that health insurance plans cover access to telehealth, and that we have broadband or cellular service across Vermont so everyone can access the telehealth services that we need. But doing everything we can right now to address not only something that's a crisis here in Vermont, but this crisis across this country. Thank you.
Dr. Myers?
Yes, I think the question was, what can the federal government do to help improve mental health? Some 20 years ago, Senator Wellstone, senator from Minnesota, passed a bill which established parity in payment between physical and mental health. For some reason, that never, even though the legislation's there, it never really came to fruition in real life. There is a real discrepancy between what insurance companies will cover for medical and for psychiatric and psychological help, and we need to close that gap. We need to research what works, as we do in every other part of medicine. We shouldn't necessarily be paying for thousands of different kinds of therapies that are not proven. If people want to pay for that out of their own pocket, that's well and good. But I think when we use taxpayer money, we need to figure out what works and concentrate on that. Senator Sanders has been absolutely instrumental in terms of boosting the community health centers, which across the country, probably the major area where people on Medicaid and the uninsured and even insured can now get ready access to mental health, because even if you have good insurance, often you can't find a therapist who will accept it. So the community health centers have played a huge role and need to continue. And finally, we need, as has been mentioned, we need to work on alcohol and drugs, which is just a crushing problem at any age and in every community. Alcohol is under recognized as a problem. Here in Vermont, we have one of the highest incidence or prevalence of alcohol abuse. We see people dying every day here at Rutland Regional, men and increasingly women. So we need to work on the alcohol and drug problem as well. Thank you.
Ms. Clifford?
I'll briefly share a little bit of my story. College was really hard for me. I went to a school that had a similar demographic breakdown to Castleton. It was about 4% Black, and I felt like I had no business being there. I also had the school's debt collector call me about once a week to tell me that my tuition wasn't in yet. And I really struggled to feel like I had a place. And when I reached out to school counseling services, there was about a 6-month wait list, and that's over a semester's wait. So we need far more investments in mental health supports on campus, but it's not just starting in universities and colleges. We also need to make sure those supports are there at the youngest ages. We need to invest in social emotional learning so our young people have the tools to address their trauma and respond and know how to address their mental health, their mental health. And that I think in Vermont, that the NASW says that the adequate ratio of social workers to students is about 1 to 250, and that's still probably a little high. I think in Vermont, it's about 1 to 1,250. So we drastically need to build supports and invest in social emotional learning and behavioral health professionals throughout our school systems, and that includes colleges and universities and our elementary and K through 12 systems. And also we need to make sure on our college campuses, we are, as folks have talked about, responsive to substance use and making sure that trusted community leaders on campuses have access to Narcan and fentanyl testing strips. And we also need to make sure that when folks are in the midst of acute mental health crisis, they are responded to with love and care and compassion and not handcuffs and guns. Thanks.
Mr. Madden.
I don't know enough about this issue, and I'm willing to change that. So if there's anything on any issue that you think you would like me to know, I am very open to being reached out to in this. The only exposure I do have to this issue is that I have some people in my life. One is my brother's partner, who is a counselor at a college, and a friend and mentor who is a professor of counseling psychology at UMass. And what I have gleaned from them that I do think are meaningful parts of this conversation is that young people, their mental health is undermined by, one, a lot of anxiety about what the future holds for them in terms of their economic prospects and their avenues to meaningfully contribute to society and have economic security, and also anxiety about the state of the world and the challenges we face. Because more than any other generation in history, this is one that is acutely aware of the insufficiency of the tools we have. It reminds me of this quote you've probably heard before by a super duper wise dude and philosopher named Krishnamurti, who said, "It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." So from that lens, in a way, it's a silver lining of a good sign that our young people are not well adjusted to the utter dysfunction they see. It means their souls are still alive and that they know in their hearts that we are falling far short from our potential as humanity. And in some ways, this seems like an isolated issue from other policy concepts, but I assure you it is deeply connected to what I mentioned earlier about a national service corps that provides avenues of education and meaningful skill building and contribution and financial security. And it also has a lot to do with how we respond to these civilizational scale crises like climate change. Thank you.
So we're running out of time, so we're going to jump right into closing statements. You have 2 minutes each, and we'll start with Mrs. Reddick.
Oh, excellent. I like going first. First of all, thank you, everyone. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for listening to all of us. Thank you for being here. And thank you in advance for going out on August 9th and voting in the primary and then in November for the general. And I just want to reiterate that I believe that you all have the capacity to be successful and have everything that you want. I believe that there is a way and a path for everyone. If you take the time to search in yourself, look for your purpose, see what makes you passionate, and go for that. Follow that, go in that direction. I believe in you. I trust you. I believe you know better what you need than the government knows what you need. And so when I go to Washington, I'm going to advocate for things like term limits on federal officials. I'm going to advocate for things like one topic, one bill. So no more omnibus spending packages where there are tens of thousands of pages and there's only 10 people voting on it because our legislators send their proxies. I promise you that I will actually vote on the bills instead of obfuscating that responsibility. What I would like to see is a restoration of individual rights and states' rights. I believe that Vermonters know better what Vermont needs than Washington. And we can see that with the $4.50 a gallon for gas, with the out of control drug abuse and suicidality, when we have a president who believes that he can just sign law. We're overrunning our separation of powers. and we deserve better as Americans. Thank you.
Senator Ram Hinsdale.
Thank you. I'm Senator Keisha Ram Hinsdale, and I'm running for Congress to be Vermont's fighter for our working families, our climate, and our democracy. And in my 10 years in the legislature, I have fought at the intersection of those issues, dreamed big, and delivered on a bold, progressive agenda. And that is why I have the support of the Vermont AFL-CIO and 3 other labor unions representing over 11,000 Vermonters. That is why I have the support of Bill McKibben and the Sunrise Movement chapter out of Middlebury. That's why I have the support of some of our greatest founders of social justice and civil rights movements in the state, like Tabitha Moore and like so many others who created NAACP chapters right here in these communities to simply say there is a light at the crossroads when we address the needs of our working families, our environment, and social justice. I am building a light at that crossroads. I hope you will join me there. I hope you will join not just this campaign, but this movement that we are creating to change the trajectory of this country and to bring it back to its roots, to make sure that we save our democracy from the brink and to make sure that we save ourselves from climate disaster. Please join us. My website is keishaforvermont.com. We will be out in the lobby to talk with you, and especially for our young people, I hope you will run for office. What I often will say is that when you look at who makes it to Washington, there's a real bottleneck because a lot of people who get to Washington start in politics before the age of 35. And it's a lot of white Christian men. And when they get to Washington when they're older, guess who they like to make the most laws about? Women and their bodies under the age of 35. So it is not who are you to run, but who are you not to run. So please join this movement and please run yourself, and I will be there to support you. Thank you.
Lieutenant Governor Gray.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming out tonight. As I was thinking about my closing remarks, I just wanted to recognize that if Washington operated a lot more like Vermont and like this wonderful dialogue tonight here in the Castleton Theater, I think we'd be in a good place, in a much better place. And thank you to our moderators. And thank you to everyone who organized this evening's event. We have an opportunity to write the next chapter for our state. With Senator Leahy's retirement, we have huge shoes to fill. And with potentially Congressman Welch going to the Senate, we have, for the first time, an open congressional seat since 2006. I have nearly a half decade of experience working in and with Congress, and will most certainly be ready on day one to open that door again and get to work serving you, be it on a passport issue or a small business loan or a social security issue, making sure that first and foremost, you have the best constituent services possible. Second, as your Lieutenant Governor, I've spent a lot of time listening and working across our state and engaging with you. And I know that our workforce crisis, which is profound and prolific here in Vermont, our housing crisis, our childcare crisis, our desperate need for real climate action, it will not be solved by Vermont alone. And I know I had the experience in this moment to be a very effective leader for our state and to deliver for our working families and our rural communities. We also know that our leadership on voting rights, on reproductive rights, and on climate action are desperately needed in Washington, along with the ability to work collaboratively to build really strong coalitions to deliver for our state. I'm also the only candidate who's run and won statewide, and that's important. We have to win this seat. We can't take it for granted. So please sign up to volunteer, get involved. This campaign is about all of us, and I hope I can count on your support in August. Thank you so much.
Dr. Myers.
Thank you. This is, as Lieutenant Gray said, this is a very important election. This is a critical time for our country and for the world. The next several years, we're either going to make progress or we're going to have disasters continuing to occur around the world. There's a lack of compassion, there's a lack of humanity in the world. I have some professional experience, almost 30 years in healthcare. I know the strengths and weaknesses of the healthcare system. I am eager to get to Washington and work on some legislation which can actually pass. One of the first things I would do in Washington is to join the Problem Solvers Caucus. This is a group of moderate Democrats and Republicans. It's growing in number. They are coming up with some good solutions. It's not the cure the world solutions, it's piece by piece solutions. I have some direct experience in the criminal justice system. I know its strengths and I know its weaknesses and injustices. And I'm eager to get to Washington and perhaps serve on the Judiciary Committee so that we can make the system fair, we can make it work for everyone. The key thing here is I'm a moderate, and the reason I'm a moderate is because I know that it's not that I don't share the aspirations of so many on this stage, but I know how change occurs and how it does not occur. And if we're going to make changes, we're going to have to start piece by piece. Congress is so dysfunctional. It's so dysfunctional, people have given up on it. And I think what Congress needs to do is start passing small pieces of legislation that actually affect people's lives. President Kennedy said in his inauguration in 1961, the changes he proposed may not happen in the next 100 days or next 1,000 days, or even in the course of this administration, but let us begin. Thank you.
Ms. Clifford?
You know, I worked on the Hill, and I worked with members and staffers who will never live with the impact of their policy decisions. So they're okay with piece by piece change and incremental change because they don't have to figure out how to live paycheck by paycheck. They don't go to bed thinking about how they're going to feed their families the next morning. They don't worry about their family that's living in a war-torn country and figuring out how they're going to support their family. I'm asking to represent you because I am you. I'm a young person trying to figure out how to build a life in Vermont, trying to figure out how to buy a house with student loan debt, trying to figure out if I'm going to have kids with my husband, if we're going to have a future to raise kids on, if we're going to have a future planet. I am asking to represent you because I know what it takes in Congress to actually get things done. We have far too many people who are willing to compromise at the drop of a hat at the expense of working families. And what we really need are people who are going to ask at every turn, how does this impact working families? And that's exactly what I intend to do. And I'll close by saying, I'm going to be here. This is not the only time you're going to see me. So I hope to see each and every one of you around campus many times, and I hope to have an individual conversation with each of you and learn about what keeps you up at night, what do you wake up in the morning thinking about. And the last thing I'll say is that our young people, you are not just our leaders of tomorrow, our leaders of our generation, you're our leaders of today. We need you right now. And so I hope you'll join this movement with me. Thank you.
Mr. Madden?
Nearly every politician who has ever walked the earth has said some version of, I will fight for the working person and I will give you a seat at the table. But do you think they mean that literally? Like sitting shoulder to shoulder with them? Of course they don't mean it that way. They want to give us feel-good sound bites and hope that we don't think too deeply about it. But what I am asking of us is that we do think deeply. I am asking us for us to choose our candidate, not on who has the best polished soundbite, but who has policy proposals that will actually solve root cause problems, and who has a vision for government that will give us more than a metaphorical seat at the table, but instead will give the people of this planet real power and the real responsibility that must go along with that. I do not have a silver bullet or all the answers, but I wholeheartedly believe that together we can build the solutions that we need if we change the technology, the social and governmental structure, social processes and governmental structure, and the mindsets we use to solve complex and difficult problems. But first, we must liberate ourselves from the stranglehold of the two-party system. And to do that, we must liberate our imagination from the mold that says we must keep our government wedded to a design built when information traveled at the speed of horseback, I have realistic and simple sets of policy outlines that can bring democracy into the 21st century. You should check out my table or my website, rebirthdemocracy.com. And if we want future to belong to the people of this planet, then we must empower and refine our systems of collective problem solving. And with your help, we can have a future we all have a say in. We can step into the role of midwives and bring a whole new life through. Together, we can rebirth democracy. And if you think that changing players is enough, I think you have 6 good options. But if you know in your heart we must change the rules of the game, you have one clear choice. Thank you.
And to wrap us up, Senator Ballin.
Thank you. So I am an experienced legislator. I'm also an experienced legislative leader. I was a majority leader, now the president of the Senate. And any progressive legislation that has passed through the Senate chamber in the last 8 years has had my hands on it, from reproductive rights, voting rights, minimum wage increases, paid sick days, investments in housing. And I stand by my record, but more than that, I'm going to bring the experience that I have in the Senate to my work in Congress. But what I really want you to know about me is that despite all of the darkness that we see on TV, we have insurrectionists serving in the Capitol right now. Despite all of that, I am an incredibly hopeful person, which is interesting coming from somebody whose own grandfather was killed in the Holocaust and who grew up with that trauma. But I absolutely know and believe that hope is what drives us, that change is possible, and it's the connection with each other that is going to get us there. In my lifetime, I never thought I'd be able to marry my spouse legally. In my lifetime, I never thought as an out gay woman that I'd be able to run for office and then serve as a legislative leader. So I'm incredibly hopeful. And I think all of us up here know that the leadership that we need right now is not just from elected leaders. It's really not. It's the leadership that you all take in your communities and in your organizations and on campus. Leaders are people that realize that they know who they are and they can use those skills and that sense of purpose to make change. And you all are capable of doing that. And I hope that you will step most fully into your leadership in the coming months. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. All righty. That concludes our candidate forum. Give everyone a round of applause again. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And give our wonderful moderators a round of applause. Oh, brilliant, brilliant. If you would, please join us outside for some refreshments and food. That would be absolutely wonderful. And we hope that you enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you for coming out.
I know every day we got to show the world, yeah, this series of time, you know what time it is. We are going to rise, rise, rise.